sure that it's recorded right now. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share the link with the GICHD communication team, and they will share it with everybody else. Our host today is Robb. Ian joined the GICHD in May 2018 as a technical advisor in urban clearance and improvised explosive devices. He's involved primarily in the development of standards and production of publication and IED-related teams, and his role also includes the provision of training courses in support of national authorities, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders in the mine action sector. Prior to joining the GICHD, Ian has been working in Iraq, planning and implementing IED search operation in Mosul and the surrounding area. He has worked internationally as an IED search and counter IED instructor, providing relevant training to commercial companies, NGOs, and military units in countries affected by various explosive hazards. Before that, Ian served in the British Army as a high assurance search advisor and advanced EUD operator. Ian and myself will host today an interview. Our guest today, Gareth Colt from the UNDP in Yemen. Gareth Colt joined UNDP in March 2019 as a chief technical advisor. His work is focused on countering IEDs in Yemen, assisting UNDP, the Office of the Special Envoy, and the local security forces with upstream and downstream capacity building. Gareth is retired from the military service as a brigadier general in 2018. Having been the head of the UK bomb disposal profession and principal counter-IED advisor to the government. He's world-leading subject matter expert in this discipline, and his command multinational counter-IED teams on combat operation in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has proved instrumental in establishing the procedure adopted by NATO and the international community today. In his spare time, Gareth is a chartered engineer, fellow of the Institute of Explosive Engineers, a charity trustee, and a published academic. His most recent work being a comprehensive guide on homemade explosive, which sadly you won't find in Amazon. Without any further ado, I will move to Gareth's presentation. After that, we're going to follow with Q&A. Gareth, please, if you can go ahead.
Thank you, Sully, for the kind introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for getting up early or getting up late, depending on what your time zone is, and for tuning in to listen to us today. I'm going to go into screen share mode now and go through my presentation, which should be around about 30 minutes. Hopefully you can all see that. My subject is countering IEDs in Yemen. A very, very difficult subject to talk about. Lots of taboos in the words, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as I possibly can. So to start off with a threat brief, I'm going to look at 2019 initially, but I will bring out effects of 2020 as we go through. So on average throughout 2019, there were about 83 IED events per month. And by events, I mean incidents where YEMAC or the security forces attended to deal with the problem. Based on those events, we know that the IEDs themselves were 3 times more effective per event than an airstrike and twice as effective as a conventional mine strike. So you can see from that their potency is quite significant. And when we look at their effects, it's not just the communities on the land that are influenced by IEDs. There are also problems in the maritime dimension. And when we look at the statistics from civilian impact, from ACLED, and for those gathered within country from local resources, there have been 428 civilian casualties and fatalities as a result of IEDs in Yemen last year, and also 9 fishing vessels that were sadly sunk with loss of life and livelihood. When we look at the sort of threat analysis picture, there are 4 principal groups that use the IED in Yemen. The first are non-state armed groups, and they tend to use IEDs to pursue political objectives. We then have Al-Qaeda and ISIL. They tend to use IEDs to pursue their ideological interventions. But interestingly enough, for 2020, they've become quite marginalized, and there have been little more than 30 IED events involving those organizations up until August. And last but by no means least, which I actually consider one of the most problematic, is the criminal element, who use IEDs as a screen to their activities, such as the trafficking of women and children, weapons, drugs, and currencies, also body organs, exploiting the lack of rule in law in particular to meet their financial end state. And again, when we look at the security situation in Yemen, it's not bound by geography whatsoever. One governorate might have more of a threat than another, and a district within a governorate might be experiencing the IED problem more than its neighbour. So it's extremely varied, and it makes it difficult for humanitarian mine action to operate effectively, and I'll go into that a bit later. And most specifically, who is there to respond? There have been so many casualties within the security forces, particularly the police, who used to have primacy in this capacity, that it's difficult, other than the YEMAC, to respond to a number of events. And you might be pleased or shocked to hear that of those 83 events on average per month last year, the AMAC attended 73% of all of those incidents. And it does explain to a degree the casualty rates that they were experiencing. And last but by no means least on this slide, I want to point out that the vast majority of the IEDs that we come across use military ordnance and initiators within the design. That's because they're available. There's very limited control over those items. There's a war going on, which makes those that haven't functioned easily accessible, and it causes a significant problem. And those who use them enjoy the reliability and performance of a military ordnance type over homemade explosives. And to give you a snapshot of the threat, top left is a picture of a 25 kilogram IED that was recovered to a storage area and subsequently detonated, causing a 1,000 kilogram event through sympathetic detonation. Top center and top right, we have a modified PMN mine. In this case, it's attached to a remote control trigger, and it'll be used as a donor to initiate a much larger main charge. Bottom left, we have an improvised mine, pressure plate IED, nothing sophisticated in that. But bottom center, we have another IED that is initiated by pressure, but in this circumstance, the payload is actually thermobaric. It's not totally explosive. It contains a high percentage of fine powdered metal to enhance blast effects. And bottom right, we have an improvised sea mine, and we can tell it's improvised from the picture due to the arming disc that is offset at the base. And if you look more generally, I'm not going to go through the components of an IED. The type of IEDs used are pretty much the same. They comprise the 5 components you would expect to see, but there is a dominance of some types of device over others. And I put this down on the slide in priority order. Around about 70% of the IEDs that we encounter in Yemen are victim operated of some degree. Next to those are command initiated IEDs with wire or without wire, and then moving down to suicide events, which are used mainly by the terrorist actors for effects to provide a spectacular. So not very common, I would say, compared to some other countries. But what's interesting to note, depending on who is using the IED, there is a preponderance of secondary and tertiary means of initiation attached to a number of the victim operated IEDs that we encounter, making that environment slightly more testy. When we talked about environment earlier, I did mention land and maritime, and the IEDs are used in an offensive and defensive role. For example, non-state armed groups might use improvised mines to defend conventional minefields to prevent their removal. Terrorist organisations and criminals will use offensive IEDs, mainly radio control, to target specific individuals or locations, depending on what they want to achieve. It's not much different in the maritime environment, but it's mainly defensive, I would say, to protect areas of interest. And last but by no means least, we have the aerial dimension, where unmanned aerial systems, UAVs, are not specifically used to fly into targets, which might have been the case in the past, but now, because that is difficult, to fly over the target and initiate a payload which projects fragmentation downwards. So you can see there's variation in terms of what is used. And when we look at this, it's all to do with ingenuity. And most primarily, it's a breakdown in the rule of law, which sadly countries like Yemen face on a regular basis. And that breakdown is being exploited. And from my perspective, I would use the term institutionalization, where the IED is a commonplace activity to hinder security freedoms. But also, very little waste occurs. Main charges are generally designed for the target in which they're going to affect. There's no waste in terms of explosives or whatever they can gather. And as for technical innovation, I'm just going to talk about two of the pictures at the bottom of the slide. Technical innovation in the maritime environment. You've all seen boats like this on the television. It's unmanned, but most specifically, it's guided onto a static target through GPS waypoints. You just start the motor and off it goes. Quite technical, I would suggest. And on the bottom right, we have an improvised torpedo, which is guided by an outboard motor, but it's actually steered through servos from a toy. So you can see the sophistication in some degrees that is being used. And in terms of the security envelope, which is always important for us to talk about from the humanitarian context, thanks to ICRC's work and GICHD's, I'm able to, with the mine action team, talk about hot and cold areas. On cold IEDs, I mean a legacy. They're classed as explosive remnants of war. The battle has moved on. The area is safe for humanitarian mine action teams to operate. And as long as you're qualified, competent and current to deal with the threat that you find, that's the IED, that is all that is necessary. It comes down to the training and the ability to deal with what you're finding. In the hot space, the contact battle is still ongoing. Perpetrators might be lying in wait in the area. Command devices are a concern, and that's not really where humanitarian mine action wants to operate. But again, if we look at the casualties that the police and the military have taken, and YAMAC's response to 73% of incidents, it's not always possible to say that YAMAC will not turn up to a hot IED situation. And that's why training is vitally important and threat assessment. And of the IEDs that we've encountered, I've tried to pull together statistics over almost 3 years. These statistics are taken from YAMAC's database. And what I want to point out really is, yes, the threat is geographical, in particular governorates, most specifically Hudaydah, Hadramaut, Aden and Taiz. And that's where UNDP is trying to focus effort in concert with the UNMAHA mission that is going on. But if you look at the figures on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that the average number of IED events per month is declining. I've mentioned 61 for 2019, but in the slide previously, I said 83. Sadly, that figure is different as a result of the figures that we would get from the Criminal Investigation Department to actually give us a good idea of what is happening. For 2020, that figure is much, much lower. And what I'd like to say from that is that information management is getting better. COVID-19 is as scary to people who use IEDs as anybody else, I would suggest. But it's difficult to identify trends. And when we look at Hudaydah, for example, we can see that the number of IEDs in 2020 has dropped significantly. Is that because we're getting better at reporting? Is it because we are getting better at understanding the different types of explosive hazard that we are facing? Lots of questions to be answered, but when I speak to UNMAHA, they do tell me that that figure isn't far off. So something is improving or something is changing in some of the areas in which we work. And sadly, I'm not going to get the figures from the Criminal Investigation Department anytime soon, because the head of that department died from COVID-19 in May, and we have to re-establish that relationship, one of the realities of working in a country like Yemen. So as for project background, it's really important to give you a feel for how we started and what we've been doing. And ultimately, it was a combined governance and rule of law and mine action initiative, which started March of last year to look at the IED problem and see if we could actually create some space. A strategic study was conducted. That took around about 6 months to pull together. It looked at all of the organisations involved in what we would class as a counter-IED process and made some recommendations. Strangely enough, with most counter-IED activities, you would expect resolution to be through a cross-government process. It's still pretty much the same, but if you look at the ministries that we got in touch with, we soon found out that the Ministry of the Interior was the one that had primacy in terms of trying to deliver a counter-IED response in Yemen, and that was within the internationally recognised government, which is what we had best access to. Nor would you be surprised to hear that in a situation like Yemen, it would take several years to do counter-IED effectively. So we broke that down into the now, that's today, what can we do to save life, a 2-year time frame and a 7-year time frame. And nor would you be surprised to hear that if we were going to do this properly, it would cost $69 million. And no donor has $69 million to put into a counter-IED activity. It's best to look at the quick wins we can achieve, how we can save life and livelihood as the political process in Yemen, which remains elusive, endures. So we adopted a number of advocacy issues. You can see those on this slide. And we started to deliver community level solutions with humanitarian mine action principles to the local security forces from October to see if we could actually help what was going on. Again, targeted to geography, and I will come on to that in a moment. Similarly, UNIDEA was tasked by the Secretary General to look at a model or tool that could be used to assess the counter-IED maturity of a state. And we asked if we could pilot that model to provide external verification to the strategic study that we had also conducted. And that pilot was run between August last year and February of this year with the support of the government of Yemen. And the results were pretty interesting, and I'm going to show you those again in a moment. Following that, we wrote a concept note for the donors in February. We've updated that concept note, and as at August, as at today, we are now looking at counter-IED on a human rights-based approach, and I'm submitting that information mid-September for funding. But the bottom bullet is really important on this slide. Counter-IED is a taboo subject. Lots of people have different opinions. So this is what I'm going to try and portray. What about defining language? At no stage have I mentioned attack the network, defeat the device, or prepare the force. To me, I think counter-IED is a process, and that terminology from a humanitarian perspective is irrelevant and causes confusion. We should be looking at upstream and downstream capacity building that strengthens institutions to be able to deal with the problem. And when we look at IED threat mitigation, that's specifically the mine action part that we are all very, very comfortable with. That's really downstream capacity building. There is some in the upstream area, as I will show you, but it is separate from counter-IED terminology that people tend to use verbatim. And also from a human rights-based approach, I put nothing next to that. It's that novel, it's that new. We are doing that as at today, and I'm going to show you the progress that we've made in human rights-based approaches using counter-IED principles. But ultimately, it all comes down to establishing measures of effectiveness that donors might understand, that the community of interest understands, and then using those against tangible outputs to prove that something is changing. If you do A, B will happen. If you don't do A, B won't happen. And that is what we've tried to do. We've not put any military jargon in there because it tends to confuse. We've got buy-in from the national community of Yemen, where we've been able to get the buy-in, and we've progressed forwards as best that we can. And we also try to provide donors with an indication of the costs that are associated. And you'll see some pretty small costs in this presentation and the impact that those small costs have achieved in making Yemen's situation better. This is upstream capacity building. I've based it on the UNIDEA model. Again, I would recommend people to read what is online about the UNIDEA model and perhaps think about using it as a template for lots of things they do. By upstream capacity building, I mean what happens before an IED event occurs. And as you can see, 1 is the worst possible state the country could find itself in, and 5 is where it is so sophisticated it doesn't have to worry about IEDs at all. Yemen's hovering in upstream capacity building between level 1 and level 2. That means there are a lot of organisations involved in trying to do something, but they're not coherent, and they have shortfalls significantly in equipment and training and the doctrine and processes to be able to deliver effect. If you look at the slide, I mentioned security control of explosives being a problem. Yes, it is, but in some locations, services are doing their best to try and alleviate that, but it's not fantastic. It's not everywhere, and it's not to a defined policy. IED risk education does occur. It occurs where people have access, and it occurs on generic themes, not those specific to Yemen. And perhaps we need to look at threat matrices that relate to Yemen specifically by district and community, rather than a country as a whole. People do share information and they do cooperate where possible. The local security forces understand there are issues with their borders and they try and implement activity where they can, but there's a war going on, the borders are huge, and they have no technical support to assist them in covering such large areas. And if you look at downstream capacity building areas, again, Yemen's hovering between 1 and 2. The same argument applies. But if you look at one thing, the judicial process scores 2 out of 5. And I'm quite proud of that, because the judiciary and those that are responsible for trying to establish law and order are doing their best to do so. The main issue is it's based on confessions. If you don't confess, it's unlikely you're going to get convicted. So from a perspective of improving areas even further, it really has to go on to an evidence-based system. Because believe it or not, in Yemen, if you commit a crime in a community, you can be tried at community, district, governorate, and appeal to Supreme Court if you want. The judicial system is pretty strong, and it needs to be used to better effect. So Yemen's not great in terms of countering IEDs from a humanitarian perspective using upstream and downstream capacity building, but there are areas that we can work on to improve the situation considerably. You don't have to do all of these in concert. Focus on the specific areas you can deliver effect in, and you'll see them pulling other areas up in terms of numbers. And that's what the UN has available. And again, thanks to the Secretary General's discussions about having a UN IED response cycle. These are all the UN organisations that are involved in upstream and downstream capacity building to a certain degree. This isn't all the upstream and downstream stuff that the Unity model identifies. For example, I put victim assistance on there, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But the Unity model doesn't specifically look at victim assistance, but you can see all the organisations that are involved in that sort of activity, and that can provide a degree of assistance to Yemen. Again, this task force is new. It's been chaired by UNMAS, and people are trying to do their best to work out how they can support countries better. And this is where I sort of distill it into UNDP's approach. Again, looking at those upstream and downstream capacity building measures. There's lots of flags on there for UNDP. Some have got green borders and some have got red borders. Well, in terms of working with donors and trying to identify problem sets, the green borders are areas where mine action and rule of law have worked particularly well together to deliver effect. And they're areas that neither has really significant issues in working with the other to try and make better. From a donor's perspective, however, you can see some of the flags are highlighted in red. And that's where rule of law works specifically to try and strengthen institutions. So we're trying to segregate mine action and rule of law to try and make the donors understand what we're doing a bit better. But as you can see, it's a very, very powerful tool. But what we don't do is identify perpetrators, nor do we lead intelligence operations. But all I can say from that is other organisations in the UN concept can assist in those areas. And over time, indirectly, when you strengthen an institution, you do increase its ability to deal with both of those crossed areas. But rule of law and mine action are not doing it within the humanitarian context. And what about human rights? I'd love this slide to be filled, but sadly it's not. Very, very quickly, we have very difficulty engaging with northern Yemen. We have better chances at dealing with southern Yemen in terms of working with the internationally recognised government. And we also understand in a frontline community like Taiz or Hadramaut or Shabwa that it's all about community interaction. It's all about community liaison, finding out what the community is facing problems with. Does the community have problems with IEDs and explosive hazards? Well, if you look at all the consultations that we have done with UNDP on the rule of law programme, the answer is yes. We have statements from hundreds and hundreds of people, from governors, from heads of schools, colleges, about how the IED is affecting security freedoms. And when you've got that evidence base from the human rights perspective, you can then look at capacity building in any way that you think is necessary, and that works. And that's why we've run a counter-IED pilot in Hadramaut and Shabwa, which I will come on to, because we have the seeded activity from community concerns highlighted in those governorates, and we're able to take it forwards. Yemen's political solution is Martin Griffiths' biggest headache. And from that, at some stage, we will get into the policy reform aspects at the top level, but we're far off from that, and we don't have the ability to focus on that at the moment. So it's trying to instill a human rights-based approach at the lowest levels first, to bring them up governorate by governorate where we can gain access. And as I said earlier, that's what we're working on as at today. And what have we achieved? Well, I'd love to say that we have written a national counter-IED strategy. They're quite easy to pull together when you look at all the sort of areas that need improvement in Yemen. But that can't be implemented until Yemen has its own national security strategy. But that's something that would inform that. The work has been done. And as you can imagine, at the top level, at that strategic level, it does strengthen governance and the rule of law at that national context. We've also worked with OSSESG in terms of ensuring that the IED is a recognised weapons system in any ceasefire. That is now written and tabled into any future ceasefire proposals. And that means one of two things. It means that parties who have used the IED, similar to mines and other aspects, are going to have to remove them after a ceasefire. And if they are used in anger during a ceasefire, an investigative mechanism starts and looks at why, who, how, and when. In terms of standards, we've worked with GICHD, are still working with GICHD to establish a formal national mine action standard for improvised explosive devices. It's in draft, it's in English, it's in Arabic. It's good enough for government work at the moment. That's a terrible term to say, but it does what it says on the tin, and it's something for the national authority to look at in detail over time, developing and making sure that it improves. We've looked at all the security forces, as I mentioned, and we've written standard operating procedures, again in English and Arabic, for the security forces, which are equally applicable to YEMAC as they are to the police. But we don't expect YEMAC to follow them. We expect YEMAC to understand, in a way, how the police operate in an environment and what philosophy and principles and security and safety mechanisms they adopt. So these SOPs are pretty good. Quite happy to share them with everybody. They show you what a problem is and what the principles are to hopefully overcome them. You wouldn't be surprised to hear either that most people die from IEDs as a result of poor agency response. There's no multi-agency coordination, and that's something, again, that the SOPs consider. They look at how you can pull organisations together, fire, ambulance, security, to sort out a problem and respond quickly so that the problem or the situation is returned to normal as soon as you can. I've talked about linking IEDs to the security environment. What have we done there? Well, one thing that the mine action teams have done is they've established the Yemen Mine Action Coordination Centre. That's like an operations room, the sort of terminology that Gareth Colt would use. But it ties all the humanitarian principles together. And when we link that to a governorate operations room, which is looking at the overall security situation in the country, We can see a linkage of information there, which ensures that people turn up to incidents that they're qualified and trained to deal with, and that the threat isn't so significant that it puts humanitarian actors at risk. Information management has been appalling. I think we can all agree in some areas it seems to be a running theme in a lot of the work that we do, and we've had to work very hard to try and improve understanding. That's a work in progress. Getting people to understand the types of IED has been a significant issue to overcome, and how they report against them. I'll cover training needs analysis in a moment, but suffice it to say, when you look at any problem, you have to look at the training needs and the course design that is associated with restoring that problem or improving the situation. I'm very pleased that the UNDP model has validated the results of the strategic study that we conducted last year. I think it's important to get external validation and to make sure that you're either on task or you're off task, and that where your lines of approach are correct. As I also said, capacity building at the lowest level is what we're focusing on at the moment to save life and livelihood whilst the political situation comes to the fore. So we've done an awful lot of work in 12 months, but what does that mean in real money? Well, I'm going to talk about the Hadramaut and Shabwa pilots that we put in place at the beginning of this year. Why Hadramaut and Shabwa? Well, you saw the pie chart. It shows there's a degree of threat there, and it's somewhere where UNDP is able to operate reasonably safely. And for example, there's a UN hub in Hadramaut which can be used to project humanitarian operations. We also had the support of the Ministry of the Interior. We had the support of the National Mine Action Authority and the governors. And when you have support from a governor, you know that you can operate to a certain degree without undue concern. And most importantly, we explained to those two governorates what we were going to do in English and Arabic so that there was no misunderstanding, and we ensured that we had written consent before we actually started. We looked at the threat assessment for those two governorates, and you'd be sad to hear that over a 2-year average, every time YEMEN responded to an IED related incident, there was 1 casualty in 12 incidents attended. I think you'll all agree that is a significant number, and there are reasons for that. When you take a casualty, your team availability decreases. The AMAC teams in Hadramaut and Shabwa, their availability was below 50% as a result of that. And when you have a situation that comes to the fore, they're unable to respond as effectively. Other explosive hazards come to play. More casualties occur. The police are unable to respond to incidents as effectively as they did in the past. Further erosion occurs in the rule of law process. So this is where I intend to talk about the training needs analysis. What were the capacity shortfalls that the YEMEN was facing and which led to the casualties that were imposed? Well, there were a number, and the vast majority were training, understanding, and philosophy and principles of IED activities. And by looking at those, and again, I've got the training needs analysis that we can share with you, we organised a course around those shortfalls. But what we had to do was make sure that any course was acceptable in terms of international mine action standard competencies. But we also have to realise that both humanitarian mine actors involved in this process and civilians are dying in number. And it's no coincidence that in any short period of time will we be able to train the AMAC to any EOD or IDD competency which allows them to operate to an IMAS. But we can do something as an interim measure to ensure that we can deliver respite. And that is what we have done in Hadramaut and Shabwa. So there's the 25 people who actually turned up to the training. 25 brave souls, no idea what is going to happen other than the briefings that they've had with lots of people like me saying, trust us. That's the hook and line equipment that they had when they turned up to training. That's all they had to deal with improvised explosive devices, and that's between all 25 individuals. This is the training that we provided. Separation from the bomb, Not fancy. You can note that the guy on the left isn't wearing shoes. He's never worn shoes in his entire life. Shoes aren't going to save his life. Getting blown up in close proximity to an IED is going to take his life. So providing semi-remote means to provide separation. Integrating teams together. On the right-hand picture, you can see the YEMEN team with a doctor. Off to the left and the right are the security forces, the police, conducting the cordon and evacuation of the area, while a suspect package is being looked at next to the vehicle that you can see in the distance. They didn't have any means of disrupting IEDs if they weren't sure what they were doing. The default setting was to get in there with their hands and hope for the best. So we taught them how to use bottle disruptors. Very, very novel technique. It's simple to do. And in Yemen, they do have access to energetics to be able to do this. And the bottle disruptor has been used on a number of occasions to prevent damage to property and to save life. This is the hook and line equipment that we left them with. It's not fancy. It's not one of those Gucci international things that you see coming in a nice bag. It does what it says on the tin. All locally resourced for less than $200, which means that when something breaks, it can be replaced locally and you don't have to worry about import restrictions or anything along those lines. Something that the teams have been very, very pleased to receive. So what's actually happened? I talked about measures of effectiveness. Well, if you provide somebody with knowledge, separation and tools to deal with an explosive threat, you're probably going to improve their chances of survival. I'd like to say, and we are very proud as UNDP working with the brave YEMEN, is that there have been no casualties in any of those YEMEN individuals and teams taught since January, and they've dealt with over 170 IEDs in that time. That's much better than 1 in 12. And when we look at the human rights-based perspective and community consultations, what has the community come back and said to us? Well, we prevented a mass casualty event in a market in Mukalla, and the police control and the YEMEN control was a significant contributor to that. Cordoning, evacuating, getting people to safety, and then being able to deal with the IED when there's nobody around who can get hurt. A remote control IED was placed at the Ramada Hotel. That's the UN hub. It wasn't there to kill anybody from the UN staff, but it closed down the main arterial route from an airport to a port. The target was the governor, a critical character in future ceasefire negotiations for Yemen. The YEMEN turned up, quickly realised it was an IED that they shouldn't probably be dealing with, but they had the presence of mind to use a disruptor, a bottle charge, and got rid of it very, very quickly, saving the life of the guests in the hotel, residents, maintaining openness of the main corridor, the road. And also, with those community consultations, people within the community know what to do when they see something suspicious now. They report it to the police report it to the YEMEN consider the security threat around them, and then they respond appropriately. So we haven't trained many people, and that's down to funding, but we have trained 25 people. It's not a large percentage of those in the south. And I go back tomorrow, in fact, travel back to Yemen tomorrow to do another 2 lots of training, one in Hadramaut again, and another one in Taiz to start opening up the corridors of assistance there. We've worked with DDG because we also realized that risk awareness is important. So all the team leaders operating in the context of southern Yemen have been trained in IED risk awareness, and DDG has delivered that training for us during the COVID situation. So that's around about 50% of team leaders aware of the risks associated with IEDs and how they can respond accordingly with their teams. And the last point on this slide really tells you that you can deliver 12 people's worth of training based on those competencies for $10,000. That includes all of the equipment, all of the training aids, the incentives that are necessary to get them to come to the training, feeding them and providing the transport to do so. And I think that is a significant return on your investment. So outcomes, what's it all been about? Well, I think you'll agree that we have saved lives, property, livelihood, etc. in Hadramaut and Shabwa, by spending $20,000. Team availability has also gone up from 50 to in excess of 90%, which means that the YEMAC is able to respond to a larger number of normal humanitarian related activities involving explosives, remnants of war, let's say. It's also allowed the police to respond to a lot more incidents, and that impacts on crime and then restores confidence in the rule of law, which is what all this is about, giving strength to the community to be able to regain their security freedoms. You'd be pleased to hear that humanitarian corridors have remained open despite COVID-19, because the mine action teams don't stay off when COVID's about. They've been working every single day, and by removing explosive hazards and IEDs on those roads in those governorates, they've allowed that aid to get through. And when we go back to looking at the effectiveness of an IED, which I talked about earlier, 3 times that of an airstrike, we have actually saved life and livelihood to over 500 people in those governorates based on the lethality statistics that we pulled together. And that's ranged from women and children to individuals critical to an enduring peace. And what we're hopefully going to do, if funding endures, is roll this out across 4 further governorates throughout 2020 and 2021, with assistance from the NGOs. And if I took you right back as my final sort of point to the slide that we had on downstream capacity building, this is already focused on IED render safe and risk awareness. Only 2 aspects of that. That's what you can achieve just by focusing on small areas to uplift the others. That concludes my presentation, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to try and unscreen share, do my best to do that, and over to Ian and the team.
Hello, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Robb, Technical Advisor at the Geneva Centre. We're going to go through some of the questions that some of you have posted. And if you haven't done so already, please put it in the chat or on the toolbar on the bottom of the window. There's speech bubbles for Q&A. Okay, Gareth, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm just behaving. I'm muting when I'm told.
Okay, with the time that you've had in Yemen and working with both the security forces side and with the YEMAC over time, how have you seen the IED threat develop, the employment of the IEDs in Yemen?
I think the answer to that is that I haven't seen anything spectacularly shocking that is causing me concerned. What I would say is qualification, competence, and being current in the threat that you're dealing with are the most important things. There is a huge preponderance of victim-operated IEDs, and if anybody was to ask me, moving into the sort of definitions of improvised mines, around about 70% of the IEDs that we come across are improvised in nature in terms of improvised mines, anti-personnel mines of an improvised nature, let's say. And then the 30% that aren't are a range of victim-operated IED and then moving into the command space. The concern I have for Yemen is the way in which the command space is dominated. It's not just by terrorist organizations as you would normally think. I mentioned earlier that Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are marginalized in Yemen. There are lots of reasons for that. It's been international activity, it has been infighting, it has been successful operations run by the security forces. But the problem we have is the criminal element that doesn't adhere to any of that. And what we are seeing at the moment is an upsurgence in assassinations by what I call guns for hire. And those guns for hire have come from Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, those previous groupings, who are being paid by organizations to provide an impact, depending on where that location is. As I said, it's not bound by geography. There are fits and starts in terms of where the IED problem presents itself. And last but by no means least, for the non-state armed groups, radio control technology is used to arm and disarm items that they are using to pursue their political objectives. It's not new, but for Yemen's situation, it is novel. It's another thing that the teams, whether they are YAMAC, whether they are police, whether they are military engineering, have to think about in terms of a response. So Gareth Collett's summary of that is there is no brand new super duper threat that I've seen in Yemen, but there's a very, very intelligent use of the threats that currently exist. Over.
Thank you, Gareth. This next one's slightly related. With many different armed actors in an ongoing conflict, how do you address the potential for a team to come across both new military explosive ordnance and an IED that's maybe been used in a different way or is of a different configuration? How do you prepare the teams?
My concern for Yemen again is the huge use of advanced weapons, which have been sold by a lot of international countries to fuel that conflict. So I'm going to put the IED aside as I talk through that question, because the IED incorporates main charges. I've mentioned already military ordnance and initiators. If it's a 1.1 mass detonation activity, that's what people want to go for. But when you start looking at the use of complex weapons, which have rained down on Yemen for the last few years, you're starting to get into some really complex render safe procedures on the EOD side. And my biggest concern is the airdropped ordnance that hasn't functioned, because at some stage in terms of clearance, which involves the national authority, international support, there's going to be some quite sophisticated render safes that are required. YAMAC currently has a very basic EOD understanding in terms of conventional munitions. A lot of that training occurred before this conflict started. It's been a very, very slow process to deliver EOD related training on any of the complex weapons that we are seeing, ranging from surface to surface, surface to air, air to surface. That is my big concern, and that's an international consideration that we need in terms of assisting the national authority when the conflict eventually starts to calm down, in terms of providing focused training for what we're coming across. There are lots of official and unofficial lists of what people have used. If you go along to the AMAC store and have a look in it, you can see a lot of the official and unofficial stuff that people say has been used, which ranges from advanced anti-tank weapon systems to cluster munitions. So we have to ensure that we provide sufficient training on the EOD side, probably as a higher degree of necessity for daily activity than the IED itself. Over.
Thank you. The next one again is slightly related, but where do you see the next steps for capability development of the YAMAC specifically?
I thought about that for quite some time, and I suppose my concern from things like training needs analysis was the shortfalls that we identified, and that was, threat assessment, philosophy and principles that you might want to think about when you're dealing with IEDs, the types of IED. Did they understand what time, command, victim operated, projected, suicide meant, and were they aware of what protocols they would want to adopt around those? And then we sort of hit on equipment. So from the YAMAC's perspective, they were the shortfalls that we focused on for the training needs analysis, but that training needs analysis also identified a number of other areas that we would need to be focusing on over time. I'm going to talk about information management as being a key aspect on that, improving the way in which information is gathered and recorded, so that the AMAC improves its understanding of all of the items that it comes across. And I think we then have to start looking at what other issues are relevant to impact on that. Improved training and how you deal with stockpiles, how stockpile management is implemented. I'd hate to say a figure, but if pressed, I would say about 95% of the IEDs in Yemen incorporate military ordnance and initiators. There's no need to do anything else while you have access. So again, assisting the national authority in stockpile security and management and delivering sort of advice and guidance on that would be particularly useful. Risk education saves an awful lot of lives. Focusing on risk education that is Yemen specific, not global. And again, that comes down to looking at the threats. And you might have to deliver risk education in one district that is different to another, or one governorate to another. So it has to be a tailored and appropriate solution. And I suppose the last 2 points, which are upstream capacity building, it's getting better at technical exploitation, understanding the types of IED that are there, and then recording that information so that other organisations coming in and moving into particular areas know what the threat is. And last but by no means least, strengthening the judicial system. I mentioned earlier about confessions-based. If you come across a very wily criminal operating in Yemen, as long as he doesn't say anything, nothing's going to happen. So we have to get back to a sort of evidence-based system, and that's providing strengthening of how the criminal investigation department and other organisations work. So for YEMAC, the situation is maintaining a focus on the training that is relevant in the what I called the now time frame earlier, from the very first slide that I put up in terms of talking about progression, and looking at where we move in terms of downstream capacity building at the 2-year point, and then focus arcs onto what else is going to bring the situation to a better time. The training and needs analysis is the key, and designing a course around the shortfalls initially. Over.
Thank you, Gareth. A question here that follows on from something you mentioned in regards to PSSM from Sylvie Bucco at the Geneva Centre, is looking at the issue of the access to IED components. What is actually being done in terms of PSSM activities, and who is in charge? Now, I don't know if the question is who's in charge in Yemen or who's in charge from an international response, but would you be able to answer those as well?
I suppose in terms of the physical stockpile and security management of a governorate or a district or whatever, the military are actually responsible for ensuring the stockpile security of their ordnance piles. But in terms of recovered ordnance awaiting disposal, that's the responsibility of the YEMAC. And when we go back to the slide that I showed you on a level 2 out of 5 for stockpile management, the YEMAC isn't particularly too bad at the security, but again, they're reliant upon local security forces providing the security for their stockpiles. So there is no real policy or legislation on how to do this properly. And that's one of the areas in terms of technical competency that needs to be gradually introduced to allow both the military and the YEMAC to get better at managing the safety and security, and actually information sharing as to how that can be done. One thing is providing sufficient funding and access to dispose of what we have already, and that's something that UNDP through the Mine Action Programme is doing its best to resolve. But trying to get ranges, a lot of the ranges have to be cleared before they can be used, if you understand my points from that. So it's not a simple process of just finding a big area and blowing stuff up. There's a lot of other activity that needs to be conducted in the interim. Last but by no means least, there is so much out there from so many years of war. We don't know who has got what squirreled away where, and we tend to find quite surprisingly, just by chance, there may be some community areas, houses or whatever, where people have stored 500 to 1,000 anti-tank mines. There's no reason for it. They've just stored them, which again is not a sensible thing to be doing. But again, through information management and information sharing and cooperation, going back to that human rights-based approach I was talking about earlier, we can improve all of that security and stockpile aspect. But principally, from us as an international community, we need to focus on how we can deliver effect as quickly as we possibly can through training and education. Over.
Thank you, Gareth. I'd like to focus a bit more on the humanitarian side. We have a question from Stefano Toscano, the director at the Geneva Centre. The question is, isn't there a risk in using counter-IED as an umbrella covering all that you do? Humanitarian actors, for example, are not supposed to engage in counter-IED activities, at least in the terms of how counter-IED is typically understood.
Yeah,
so the question is there a risk?
It's how you manage the risk. I would say, Ambassador, in response to the question, because one of the things that obviously we have to do when we look at a country from the outset is what resources are available to assist us in in upstream and downstream capacity building. Let me use that term instead of counter IED, and what sort of neutrality and impartiality considerations affect the way in which they operate. And from that, you can gradually draw a picture of who is available to operate and what their arcs and constraints might be. So certainly for using humanitarian responses to deal with explosive hazards and IED problems, that is a specific consideration we need to look at, which is why we try to split areas into hot and cold, which is why we try to integrate operations rooms that the YEMAC might have to the local security forces to make sure that we are as compliant as we possibly can be. The big issue, I suppose the elephant in the room that people never tend to sort of notice, is that the YEMAC response is significant because there is nobody else to respond to do that. And you can see responses from a humanitarian context, you can see responses in a military engineering perspective, and you can see responses in support of the police. So ultimately what we need to do is, if we are going to bring this forwards positively in Yemen, using humanitarian resource to bite away at the problem where it can, is to make sure that we comply through the human rights based approach on the sort of neutrality and impartiality aspects of it. It's not easy. I haven't got a magic wand to improve that situation, but by starting the journey now and applying common sense and what we know to the sort of arcs that people have to operate in is a significant benefit. Ultimately, for security response in Yemen, control eventually needs to be returned back to the police to conduct the activities that we would understand in the hot space. Over. I hope that's answered the question. It's a very good question, and thank you for raising it.
We're not quite finished with it yet. I'm just going to follow on from Rory Logan, who asked a similar question, but has asked, would UNDP be suggesting that we revisit the terminology in the IMAS glossary and the definition of counter-IED?
I don't think, it depends how much policy work people want to get absorbed into. I'm not a policy writer, but I understand, having worked with GICHD and the other international organisations over some time, how important the policy sort of definitions are for certain activities. I think counter-IED is okay as a terminology, but it's when you get into the emotional aspects of what people might want to call attack the network and whatever else these days. And I just think talking about a whole UN approach to the problem and looking at it in terms of upstream and downstream capacity building is effective. I mean, we can manage to sort of filter those issues into what the definitions of counter-IED are from there. But certainly it's a massively constraining definition if we just look at it as it is in policies. And that's why I think over the years it has been such an emotional subject to discuss. So my considerations really for everybody to think about is, look really closely at what those upstream and downstream capacity building measures are, what organisations are available to assist, what mandates and constraints they operate under. And from that, you have a template, you have a plan on how to proceed, and that is what we are trying to do with Yemen. And at some stage, if at all possible, based on the Secretary General's direction, we would consider using Yemen as a pilot to try and take this concept further forwards. The key advantage is that we have an acceptance from the internationally recognised government. That's the government that we have to work with. I've mentioned access in the north is difficult, but it is a start point to see how things progress. And from my perspective, just looking at a small number of those upstream and downstream initiatives, we've achieved a significant amount in 2 governorates. If we can crack the human rights-based approach from the community consultations and everything else, it's morally acceptable to be doing what we are doing, and that's something we need to take away with us and consider over time. But you have to have the evidence base. You have to be able to, look somebody in the eye and say, yes, we've done this. It's complied with what we're supposed to be doing as humanitarian organisations. It is working. Yemen has improved. Let's try this somewhere else, or try and work out where else we can focus effort. Over.
Thank you, Gareth. Another question, which is again slightly related to the interoperability, possibly, is we've talked about information management, and you've talked about gathering and reporting. Something that's been discussed previously as well as information sharing. Now, as your time as a commander of counter-IED troops in countries, and now with Yemen, how important is information sharing, especially considering security forces or a humanitarian organisation may be the first to find a new IED?
It's absolutely vital, to be honest. I mean, the sort of adage would be, if I give you an example of Afghanistan, for example, we put a ban on ammonium nitrate, which reduces an IED problem significantly. But if you look at your predicted threat analysis and trends analysis, it's no surprise that people turn to potassium chlorate. So in terms of predicted threat analysis and information sharing, getting that information early on, you can then knock a further spade out of the hand of the person that's trying to cause harm with it. So how you share information is really, really important. And that's where I talk about the distinction between the 2 operations rooms, the humanitarian ops room, let's say through the WIMAC, and then the local security force operations room. It doesn't have to be handing evidence over. I don't think, I think that breaches neutrality and impartiality as far as the humanitarian organisations are, the NGOs. But the discussion of what people have found is something that's really important. And even if that's done through negotiations on a monthly basis, so there's like a coordination group in terms of how things are going to be taken forward, that's effective. I think we as a collective should have a more robust information sharing system. I don't currently think we do. I think further work needs to be conducted on that, and I think it needs to be based on a lot of approved and agreed definitions. And where we've come to the fore in Yemen is taking a small number of the definitions that were in the UNMAS IED lexicon and getting people to understand that at the outset. Not all of the definitions that are included there, but if I was to tell you that initially people didn't understand the difference between a victim operated device and a command device, but just through simple questioning and understanding they were able to do that, their reporting was significantly better. So we use no more than 15 terms in terms of information management activity for IEDs in Yemen. And that's something that those are trained and something that those who've had risk awareness are able to use in the reporting systems that they approach. So we get a better understanding of that. If we can do that with the local security forces as well, when it comes to the hot and the cold areas, we can have better informed discussions between the 2 as to actually who should be responding. So over time, when let's say capacity building delivers and starts to return security force primacy in some particular areas, that information sharing will prove invaluable. But we're never going to have a system that will naturally link everything that we do in the humanitarian community to everything that is done in a local security force environment because of those neutrality and impartiality issues. But it doesn't stop us having discussions about trends. Because a trend isn't evidence. Over.
Thank you, Gareth. This is my last question, so possibly while Gareth answers it, others may want to get some more questions in before the end. But the UN Secretary General's report just recently came out on countering IEDs. There's a lot in Yemen in there. Is there anything specifically you'd like to mention about the report, especially in regards to capability development?
I think the report is very good. We have to say that because we had input into it, and it does describe a global trend in terms of the way in which future conflicts are experiencing issues with improvised explosive devices, and what we as an international community can do. My specific bit from that is looking at the strength that the Secretary General talks about in terms of upstream and downstream capacity building, the sort of effort he's putting into pushing forwards a task force of some description where principles and ideas can be shared and then possibly implemented or supported within certain countries over time. Raising awareness internationally where awareness might not necessarily be in terms of precursors, because the thing that we tend to do on everything is we tend to react rather than be proact, I would say. And precursors are the way of the future, because let's say, for example, if Yemen closes down its stockpiles as a result of effective physical security and stockpile management, the natural trend is to go to homemade explosives. So if you look at a trends analysis of the supply chain in Yemen, what's likely to be used in the homemade explosives? And again, if you have policy and process in place which enables us to identify what those things might be, there could be simple protocols that can be put in place to prevent them being used. Could be prevention, substitution, or what I would also call dumbing down. So making sure that precursors that are available are below a concentration or limit that can be used in viable detonators or main charges. So there's a lot in that report. I would really encourage people to read it in terms of the trends it portrays, and in terms of where the international community, member states, can work a lot more closely together to start to deliver impact very early on for little investment. Over.
Gareth, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the questions that we have at the moment. In fact, one has just come in. Give me more. Gareth, would it be possible to have an update on the Massam project, and specifically how the project coordinates, upholds standards and shares information with UNDP and Yemen?
We do have cooperation with the Massam project. From the mine action perspective, it's obviously a lot more focused on that side, so I'm not the best person to answer that question. But most certainly there have been interactions with Project Massam to try and identify what sort of issues they are facing. The key bit comes down to improved information sharing there. I think from my own personal perspective, information sharing between one large commercial contract and humanitarian mine action activity should be pursued. It should be a lot more open in terms of what is portrayed. But then you have issues with the sort of countries that are involved in sponsoring and supporting Project Massam and what commercially they are allowed to divulge. So I'd love to be able to answer that question and say everything's tickety-boo, which is a great term. If anybody who's listening from a second language that isn't English, it means everything's fantastic. But it could be much improved in terms of volume, even volume of conventional munitions that are being discovered and removed, and types of advanced weaponry that is being discovered and removed. But again, there's lots of political issues associated with that. I'm sure you can agree. But suffice it to say, I know that the humanitarian mine action teams operating through UNDP have reached out to Project Massam, and we have had dialogue. Over.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Suleiman now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Ian, for this really interesting topic. I want to thank you, and also I want to thank all the participants for attending. If you have any further questions about the GICHD and its involvement in Yemen, also about UNDP and involvement and cooperation between GICHD and UNDP in Yemen, please feel to contact us. Myself and Ian are available to provide any questions and any answers. There will be a link to this webinar that we will share with the GICHD.com, and they will share it with everybody through the channels. You know, this was a very interesting topic, and I'm very glad to have Gareth with us before he leaves to Yemen tomorrow. So safe journey, and we're looking forward to meet you there, actually.
Looking forward to it, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Over.
Welcome. Thank you. Okay, that's conclude our webinar for today, just in time. So I wish everybody a pleasant day, and hopefully we'll see you in the future with more interesting topics from GICHD. Peace out.